I'll open up Chrome and go to Google. I'm going to right-click on the logo to inspect it. I'm looking for the ID so I can copy it. And then I'm going to head over to the JavaScript console. I'm going to start with an empty closure. And then I'm going to set up a few local variables within the closure. One for ID, one for content, and then a third one for target. I'm going to prefix target with an underscore to indicate that it's an internal variable only. And then I'm going to set up the return object. It's going to contain two public methods. The first one is for ID, and it's going to contain a return statement that returns this to support chaining. But before the return, I'm going to capture the argument into the corresponding local variable. And the public method for content will be very similar. I'm going to try it out to verify that I can set the ID and that I see a returned object. Additionally, when I set the ID, I want to capture the target to the internal local variable that I set up for target. And when I capture content, I want the internal HTML of the target to be set. I'm going to try it out so I can see it in action. I didn't pass an argument, so I see undefined. So this time I'm going to pass it an empty string. And now I'm going to set it to some HTML with an ID. Now redefining the ID redefines the target. I'm going to pass a string into my new target. And when I inspect this, I'll see my container with the string inside. My next method is going to allow me to set up CSS properties. The argument will be JSON, so I can define multiple CSS properties. The method doesn't exist yet, so I'm just going to copy it for later. Before I can use it, I need to set up the method. I'll start with the local variable that will capture the JSON argument, and the public method will be similar to the others. Return this, capture the argument, and additionally I'm going to iterate through the JSON to set each property. A quick browser refresh. Redefine the util, set the top level ID, set my container, set my string, and then paste in the call to the method. The next couple methods that I set up will allow me to set a single style at a time, and I'm going to start anticipating the ability to chain. And I'll copy the call for later. Like before, I'll set up the local variables, one for style, one for format, and then I'll set up the corresponding public methods. Style is just going to capture the property that I want to set. And format is going to capture the value of the style that I want to set. And in addition, it's going to set the format of the current target. I'm going to try it out. I'm going to recall the commands from before. Top level ID, the container, the string, the CSS, and now I'm going to paste in the call. The next few methods that I set up will allow me to specify an HTML container, the inner HTML to appear within that container, and the position for where it gets inserted. I'll copy the call for later. Like before, I'll set up the local variables for each of the public methods, container, HTML, and insert. The first two methods, container and HTML, are just going to capture the argument. And the third method for insert is going to be a little bit more involved. It'll capture the argument like the others, but it's also going to contain a switch statement. But before that, I'm going to capture the argument, but only if it has been set. I'm going to be using another internal variable for element. So for convention, I'm just going to precede it with an underscore. So the document.createElement is going to utilize the container that I specified, and it's going to capture it in element. The HTML property that we've captured is going to become the inner HTML of element. And before the return statement, I'm going to set the current target to this new element. Now I'll set up the switch statement. There's going to be two cases, one for inside and one for after. Inside we'll use append child to insert the element into the current target. And after we'll insert the element after the current target, like this. Now I'm going to try it out. Set the top level ID, set my container, redefine the ID, give the new target some content, recall the CSS, and paste in the call. When I inspect element, I can verify the placement. I'm going to set up one more public method called target. Target's going to be a little bit different. It's still going to be chainable like the other methods, but it's also going to be able to work with a handler. It's going to have its own local variable to capture the type of argument that I'm passing in. If it's a function, then it knows this is a handler that I'm passing in. Otherwise, it's just going to be a value that I want to capture in the target variable. Using apply, I can specify the scope of the function, and I can pass the target as the argument. I'm looking up the ID for the input field for later use. I'm actually going to use it to set the ID on util. And now I'm going to test out the target method by sending a handler. The handler is going to set the value of the input field. So now that I have util fully defined, I'm going to try something a little bit more interesting. I'm going to set up a long chain of calls here. Like before, I'm going to set the top level target and the content just the same. Reset the ID to the new content. Set the CSS like before. Define a new container. Define its HTML. Insert inside the current target. I'm going to change the style, specifically the color, to blue. The next container will contain different HTML. It will be inserted after the current target. Its color will be red. I'm going to insert that container again with the same HTML, but its color will be orange. The next container will have different HTML. The value for insert has been cached, so I'll call the method without an argument. And this container will be blue. Next container, different HTML. It will be inserted after as well, and formatted green. New container, different HTML. Insert after. Format red. Reset the ID to the input field. Use target with a handler so I can set the value of the input field. And I'll give this a try. One last thing I'll do is make sure that the target is the input field. And I'll use the target method with a handler to submit the form.